Kansas City is a brawling, lusty city that stands defiantly on the shores of the Missouri River, straddling 12 railroads, 7 airlines, and a network of transcontinental highways. It's the center of a thriving empire that stretches north to Iowa and to Nebraska, south to Arkansas and Oklahoma. Kansas City is noted for its beef business, the most flourishing in the nation, and for 10-story towers filled with golden grain. And how would you like your Kansas City steak, sir? Kansas City is known, too, for its baseball, for the athletics who were transplanted from Philadelphia to grow strong and sturdy in the rich, fertile soil of the mighty Midwest. Kansas City proves its baseball pride by queuing up for tickets whenever the A's are in town. In the first 2 years of its membership in the American League, the club each year drew more than 1 million fans in the spacious municipal stadium. One of the most modern in the game, this giant arena was built in record time when the A's came to town.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, of course, as you know. By now, it's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in the realm of professional sports. Thanks for coming by. We appreciate it. If you're a return listener, thanks for doing so. And if you're new to the proceedings, well, welcome, and pull up a chair. This week, as the little clip there at the beginning kind of informs us, we're going back to baseball. Hey, let's welcome back baseball, shall we? Yeah, they're finally doing the spring training thing, and looks like we're going to have a real, actual season. But it's ironic that we're having this conversation this week with our guest, Andy McHugh. It's interesting for a couple reasons. Number one, he's got a new book out, coming out on April 1st. So depending on when you're listening to this, either just prior as we drop this episode, you can order it in pre-order fashion. On our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode 254 and click on the convenient link to Amazon. And voila, you will be whisked away to the pre-order, and you'll get it as soon as it's hot off the presses. If you're listening after April 1st, well, it's available now, and you can do the same thing. Either way, you'll be giving us a couple of shekels of referral love, and we appreciate that. But I digress. Not too much. It's called Stumbling Around the Bases, the book. The American League's mismanagement in the expansion eras. And as our little clip sort of gives a little taste of, one of those interesting expansions was the Kansas City version of the Athletics, the A's. Depending on what year it was, they were either the A's or the Athletics, or perhaps confused as both. The clip there was from the preseason of 1957. That would be entering in the third year of the Kansas City's version of existence of the A's, having relocated just a few years earlier from Philadelphia, where they were the perennial number 2 team, really, in town. But as a really good example, frankly, of how the American League kind of, sort of did the expansion and or relocation thing. Frankly, not all that great. And that's kind of the thesis of our conversation with Andy coming up in just a bit. You can literally look at the listings of the franchise enablements or enfranchisements or expansions. There you go. That's what I'm looking for. Or relocations between the two leagues, American League and National League. And the National League, in many respects, looks relatively stable in the modern era. I mean, starting with the Boston Braves moving to Milwaukee, the Dodgers and the Giants, of course, moving to the West Coast in '58. And, teams basically kind of expanding and kind of sticking around. I mean, the Brewers moved to the American League in '98. The Colt 45s renamed themselves to the Astros, and the Braves, of course, moved to Atlanta. But that Braves move to Atlanta was in 1965. I think the only other time since then, I guess, was the Expos moving to D.C. In 2005. Other than that, relatively quiet and focused, those National League expansions and relocations. You look at the American League, however, St. Louis moving to Baltimore in 1954, sure. The Philadelphia A's moving to Kansas City in 55, sure. But then you get into things like the Senators moving to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then there's a new Senators team being enfranchised the next year in 61, and the Los Angeles Angels becoming a new franchise in 1961, and they renamed themselves the California Angels, and that still continues to go on. I think they're now called the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. Nope, sorry, that's actually not true. In 2016, they moved their name to fully Los Angeles Angels, which is what they were called back in 61 when they first started, but they've permutated California Angels and, craziness. And then, of course, Kansas City moved to Oakland, became the Oakland A's, and then the Seattle Pilots for a year. And then they moved to Milwaukee and became just on and on and on and on. The second Senators became the Rangers of Texas. It's craziness. And by comparison to the National League, the American League, very reflexive, very defensive, very reactionary, it seems, in its fitful evolution, shall we say. And that's the topic at hand with Andy McCue this week. And again, it's interesting timing because as the new collective bargaining agreement has been ratified and agreed to between the players and the owners here in 2022, as we get ready for another season, you'll know that there's just a ton of changes coming to the game again. In terms of a pitching clock, the designated hitter rule, which has long been a unique wrinkle of the American League. We think Charlie Finley was an instigator of such, and he's a really good example of the kind of crazy, wacky, in many cases unstable or unstable owners in the American League and their approach to expansion and whatnot. The designated hitter rule is now going to be across both leagues, right? The scheduling is going to become much more, even across both what I would argue is now what used to be known as the National League and used to be known as the American League. I mean, the watering down of the distinctions between the leagues is only going to get more pronounced, I guess, in the next couple of years. And, the intra-division rivalries are going to wane. There will be less frequency of those games intra-league. The Yankees will be coming to Pittsburgh once a year now instead of once every couple of years. I don't know what those distinctions are. So I could be the old man yelling at the clouds here, but it's interesting. We're going to be talking about the American League relative to the expansion mechanisms of the National League. But now we're in an era, it seems, where those American and national labels don't seem to matter much anymore, especially given this new collective bargaining agreement. But that said, it's part of the history. It's part of the exploration. And for sure, in our little genre of that sports history, a whole bunch of teams that have come and gone or were previously domiciled and all that kind of stuff. And that is just music to our ears and thus the excuse for our fun conversation coming up in just a moment's time with Andy McCue, the author of the brand new book called Stumbling Around the Bases. And we're going to get into the American League's, shall we say, not so straightforward approach to expansion and relocation in just a few seconds. Our sponsor of the week, Roulette Game. Let's spin the wheel, and what do we land? How about something thematic, shall we? Ebbetsfield Flannels, of course. Our friends in Seattle, Ebbets.com. That's EBBETS.com. And there, as most fans of sports memorabilia and clothing and nostalgically rich and true to history collections, Ebbetsfield Flannels is just probably the king of all of those. And a great tribute to a bunch of the teams we'll be talking about today can be found and perhaps ogled and perhaps purchased, shall we say, with their amazing Ebbetsfield Flannels at Ebbets.com. Their jacket collection, the Major League Baseball Authentic Jackets collection. These are high quality replicas of all kinds of teams and the jackets that their players and managers would have been wearing at the time. For example, there's a gorgeous St. Louis Browns 1952 authentic jacket at Ebbets.com. You can find not only the Kansas City Athletics 1960 authentic jacket, but the Philadelphia Athletics 1953 version of the athletic jacket. What are the differences? Well, the Kansas City A's one is trimmed with red and blue and has that sort of smart-looking scripted letter A on its left breast area. Not a pocket, but it's sort of where a pocket would be. And the Philadelphia version's got the really cool retro elephant with the A's little banner on its back. Really cool stuff. How about the Washington Senators? Certainly something we're going to be talking about. The 1966 version of their authentic jacket is there for you at Ebbets.com, Ebbets Field Flannels. The Los Angeles Angels, the 1961 original version. Yes, the LA Angels existed in the Pacific Coast League, but when they became or where they were expanded to in the American League, the 1961 authentic jacket version is there for you there at Ebbets.com as well. And of course, who could forget, and we certainly don't like to forget, the Seattle Pilots, the one-year wonder of 1969. You want that really cool, authentic jacket. You live in Seattle and you want to show just how deep your baseball and sports fandom runs. The Seattle Pilots 1969 authentic jacket there too. Of course, you would expect nothing less from Ebbets Field Flannels. They live and breathe and are domiciled in Seattle, of all places. And that and many, many, many other great, high-quality, thoroughly researched and painstakingly crafted items for you available there. And we thank our friends there at Ebbets Field Flannels. Again, it's Ebbets.com, EBBETS.com. And yes, a promo code for you there to save 10% off all of your purchases. That's Good Seats 10. Good Seats, the number 10. That's the promo code at Ebbets.com. Thank you, Ebbets Field Flannels. We appreciate your patronage of our little show and our support and your support for it, etc. All right, let's get into the etc., shall we? Let's talk American League Baseball. Here's our conversation we had with Andy McHugh just last week. Please, as always, enjoy. Maybe to give our audience a bit of some background, this is not your first rodeo in the realm of baseball history. What's your entree to all of this in the first place? You're not a baseball writer by trade, are you?
No, I was actually a business reporter, editor, columnist, almost exclusively in the business realm for most of my adult career. I did do some sports just because, or really baseball, because I loved it. And they'd occasionally let me off the leash to write something about baseball. But basically, I was a business reporter. And therefore, most of the stuff I've written about baseball has involved the business end of the game.
And give us a sense of how this particular story, in your mind, came about. It seems to me it was more of an outgrowth of another project, and maybe even influenced by. Maybe you could also describe who's on the cover of this book too to our audience.
The cover of the book is a picture of three. What should I call them? Leadership figures in the American League. Joe Cronin, the league's president, Bowie Kuhn, who was then the commissioner, and John Fetzer, who through the 60s and into the early 70s was probably the most influential figure in the councils of the American League owners. The book actually grew out of my previous book, the biography of Walter O'Malley. And as I was writing it, as I was writing the part about the expansion of 1961-62 and the introduction of the Angels into the Southern California market, as I looked at it, it just struck me how badly the American League had handled the entire thing. Their choice of markets, the fact that they really didn't seem to know what they want. They kept changing their mind and putting out new plans and going back and forth. But the fact of the matter was that the National League had skunked them and, got the two great markets on the West Coast. And the American League would spend the next 20 years basically trying to catch up to that. And then I started, my friend Rob Garrett wrote a very nice book about the history of the San Francisco Giants. And in reading that, I was again struck about how bad a decision it was that the American League allowed Charlie Finley to move into San Francisco. And you took a market there. The Giants had been there for 10 years at that point, and they'd averaged basically $1.5 million a year for those 10 years. The A's move in, and for the next 10 years, the two teams together average $1.7 million. So the A's weren't gaining that much. The American League wasn't gaining that much, and the Giants were taking it in the neck. And I'm thinking, this is not a good decision. And it also touches off the forced expansion of 1969. Kansas City is thoroughly angry about the departure of the A's. The American League is very conscious of that and wants to do something. So they set out to expand and give Kansas City a team. The National League does not want to go along. They do not think that baseball is ready for further expansion. But the American League feels it has to force the issue to stay out of court. So they expand with Seattle and Kansas City. And there are two more issues here. First of all, Seattle and Kansas City are much smaller than Montreal and San Diego together, the two cities that the National League chooses to expand to. Again, choosing lesser markets. One of the things I note in the book that if you look at attendance for just last year, 2021, of the 15 smallest attendance draws in Major League Baseball, 10 of them are at cities that were originally chosen by the American League. They consistently had this ability to choose the lesser markets, as they did in '69. In addition, in Seattle, they completely bollocks the way they choose the ownership group. In Kansas City, they sit down, they solicit bids, they get 4 or 5 different bids, they look at the possible ownership groups, and they choose well with Ewing Kauffman. In Seattle, Joe Cronin walks into town. This is the market they really wanted. And why they were willing to let Charlie Finley move to Oakland. They were desperately trying to catch up with attendance on the West Coast. So they felt they had to go into Seattle if they're going to go into Kansas City. So in Seattle, Joe Cronin goes in, and he goes to the only people that baseball really knows in Seattle, the Soriano brothers. Dewey is the president of the Pacific Coast League. He's in partnership with his brother Max. And basically, Cronin basically says to the Sorianos, you've got the franchise if you can come up with the money. They overlook what had led Charlie Finley not to go to Seattle in '68 when he moved the A's. He would have rather gone to Seattle, but he thought that the minor league ballpark that was available in Seattle was simply not conducive to doing anything at all. It wasn't even a good minor league ballpark anymore, much less a major league ballpark. But the American League plows ahead. The Sorianos, who don't have good connections with the business community there, as the NFL would prove a few years later, there's money. There's money in Nordstrom's. There's money in Weyerhaeuser. There's money in Boeing and other big companies that are based in Seattle, much less Microsoft years later. But there's plenty of money there, but the Sorianos don't have that connection. So they scratch around among their other brothers and their acquaintances. But it winds up that 60% of the money from the franchise comes from out of town, comes from Cleveland, basically, from William Daley, who had owned the Indians in an earlier iteration. So, this should have been a warning sign to the American League about Seattle, that they couldn't come up with local money. And so they strike they're going to go ahead. They're going to use the minor league ballpark, Sick Stadium, which is at this point 30 some odd years old. It's been owned by the city for most of the last decade and has not been maintained very well. But they strike a deal with the city that the city is going to put some money into refurbishing the ballpark. But when the American League signs that deal, they don't specify what the specifics of things in terms of number of seats and quality and the amenities that are going to be built into the ballpark are going to be. They first say it's going to be, maybe 28,000 seats. Then that's cut to 25,000. Then that's cut even more. And it's clear as you get into it, the city is just not that interested. Yeah, they like having a major league team, but they're not that interested in really doing too much for this major league team. 5 members on the city council, only 3 of them are really interested, and 2 of them are actively opposed to spending any money on the pilots. But they get the I guess you couldn't call it legislation in the city council, but they get the deal through. But then the city contract manager starts fighting, and he doesn't want to spend the money. And they're into January of 1969 with opening day, 2.5 months away before any work actually gets going on the ballpark. And of course, it's not finished by opening day. There is at the same time going on a referendum in which public money would be made available to build a new ballpark, the ballpark that would eventually become the Kingdome. And that is barely passed in February after Cronin realizes there's a problem and ships in Mickey Mantle and a bunch of other stars to, talk up the referendum. But then that gets bogged down because 2 different groups in Seattle start fighting about what the site should be. Should it, be where the Kingdome was eventually built or on another site? And then when the season opens, the pilots' fans, quote unquote, find that they are paying basically the highest prices in the majors. So you've got the combination of a bad team on the field, as all expansion teams are. You've got a crummy stadium, really. And you've got this fight that's clearly being reported in the newspapers about where the future stadium is going to go. Needless to say, attendance is not good. And as the season goes on, attendance just kind of shrivels up. The Sorianos get very worried that they're going to have a problem, not losing too much money. It's to the point I found a memo in Bowie Kuhn's papers at Cooperstown in which by the middle of the season, Kuhn's staff is discussing a reorientation of the leagues and the divisions within the leagues, moving teams around. And at that point, they've already given up on Seattle. They're talking about the team having moved to Milwaukee as if they knew something in advance.
But the pilots, was certainly, probably, the most glaring misfire of any sort of expansion franchise, I guess, even in the case of American League history. But let me step back for a second and say, at what point, though, and I guess the proverbial historical hindsight is 2020, but at what point, though, in your research, do you sort of thread together this theme of botchedness, I guess? Because in your book, you kind of go through sort of 3 waves of this, and it's almost like lessons. Most glaringly, I guess the pilots, probably being the most acute example, seem to have not been sort of learned during this sort of process. I mean, where does this originate? It almost feels like it was almost etched in stone even before that first expansion back in the 50s.
I think so. I mean, I think the whole process was deeply flawed. You did not have a strong league president. You didn't really have a strong leader. I mean, Fetzer was clearly the most influential, and he was very influential on television because that was the business he was in. And people listened to him because he was a thoughtful and a reasonable man. But I think they got caught up in this competition for markets on the West Coast, for attendance on the West Coast. And ultimately, it's a structure that did not lend itself to good decisions. Each of these guys, 8 and then 10 and even later 12, is probably not paying attention to his business. Calvin Griffith is, but the rest of these guys are, building cars or making pizza or, whatever their business happened to be, real estate, all of these things. And baseball is a secondary consideration. And so they're not coming to the table, I think, with really thoughtful approaches to what is going on, something that I think got changed in the later 70s and 80s when Lee McPhail becomes the president of the American League. And then you have somebody who's prepared to lead to the extent that he's allowed to by the owners, but also prepared to be a terrific chief of staff and give them, information that they can use. So I think it was structural. It was almost childishly competitive. I mean, when you got in, if you can go back to the 61, 62 expansions for a moment. At first, the American League says, "Oh, we're going to expand, by 2 teams in 1962," and then the National League jumps in saying it's going to expand to 2 teams in 1962, and when they picked up the ownership groups from the Continental League that became the owners of the Mets and the Astros and were clearly superior to whatever the American League was going to come into, all of a sudden, Del Webb is saying things. It was like they were 2 10-year-olds on the playground. And Del Webb is saying, well, if you're going to do such and such, we're not going to wait till 62. We're going to expand by 2 teams in 1961. And that'll show you. Well, what it did was it wound up giving the Angels 7 days to prepare for their draft. 2 months before the season starts, they don't have any kind of a staff. They don't have a ticket operation. They don't have a minor league system. None of this stuff, because the American League, was just bursting to compete with the National League in a very childish way. So, I mean, I think a lot of factors came into play. Poor leadership, this desire to catch up. One of the factors that goes back to the very beginning is that they were slow to integrate. And the quality of the teams. I mean, if you look at the All-Star games in the 60s and 70s, the National League was winning all the time because they had all those great black players that they had picked up in the 50s, Mays and Banks and Aaron, all of those guys. And so they were dominating the All-Star games. One of the most interesting things to me was looking at average attendance per game by league. And by 1966, the average National League game was drawing 47% more people than the average American League game. Then the American League changed the way it reported attendance. It moved from turnstile count to tickets sold, which made it look like bigger attendance. And yet again, by the early 70s, the National League was back to a differential of over 40% per game. So they were just outdrawing them left and right. It was the quality of the product. It was the quality of the markets they chose. It was the quality of the team owners they chose. I mean, it's not only the debacle in Seattle, but you're dealing with people like Finley and, for that matter, Bill Veeck. These guys are not team players. They are not on the lookout for the league as a whole. They are very much people who are dedicated to improving their own franchises, and not really looking at what the league needs.
But let's take a step back for a second and talk about the 50s, because it's really interesting. We sort of see this sort of great expansion sort of in other leagues. And in the case of the NHL, right, it took them until 1967 to recognize that there was, a great big Western world out there.
Yeah.
But the 50s obviously was where baseball sort of recognized that there were some greener pastures out there. And it's very interesting too, again, hindsight being 2020, it feels in some respects like the National League, especially with the great West Coast migration of the Dodgers and the Giants, right? That was sort of like a that was a seismic and in New York terms, cataclysmic sort of event, right? That in some respects, the American League almost sort of maybe didn't sort of see coming, yet it was clear in both of these leagues during the 50s that there were opportunities ahead outside. And for 30, almost 40 years, both of these leagues really hadn't changed really at all until all of a sudden, right?
Damn, yeah. Well, I think that's very true. But I mean, if you say you read the sporting news starting right after World War II up until the Dodgers and Giants move, what you've got is a kind of an intellectual recognition that those are huge markets out there and they have to get into Major League Baseball somehow. So, I mean, and this is all talk. Nothing actually gets done except maybe a study. But, are we going to expand to 10 teams each? Are we going to start a third league? Are we going to make the PCL a major league? All of these ideas are kicked around, but nothing is done. And even the National League doesn't do anything but sit back and say, oh, Walter and Horace, yeah, go ahead. I mean, this is all driven ultimately by O'Malley's recognition that this was the way he needed to go for his franchise, and his ability to talk to Horace Stoneham and say, Horace, I know you're already committed to moving to Minneapolis, but it would make more sense if you moved to San Francisco and we keep this rivalry alive, and having Stoneham buy into that. So it's a process really that at its base is driven by one owner who specifically, I think, baseball is his business. It's not any of these other businesses. Baseball is his business, and he's thinking about it. He drives the National League to the West Coast.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think he got – so obviously he was a baseball lifer by that point, right? But, I mean, in some respects, the American League almost kind of set some of these gears in motion, right? Because I think people sort of everybody sort of remembers – the Dodgers and the Giants bolting west, but people forget that a few years earlier, 54 and 55 in succession, the second team in St. Louis, the Browns, moved to Baltimore, and the second team, if you will, I'm not talking historically, but at least in terms of fandom and whatnot, the Athletics in Philadelphia moved to Kansas City, two brand new, well, Baltimore not essentially new, but essentially modern day new markets, right? And while Baltimore and Kansas City, not sort of the most gigantic television rich and fertile markets that the United States had to offer at that time, it did certainly give some sense that, hey, the old order of these teams that really haven't, moved anywhere in decades. And by the way, in certain markets where they can't even support two clubs, maybe that's sort of a modern day sort of hint that stuff needs to change. I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly reading into something, and you're the expert, not me. But I don't think it takes a rocket science when people see some initial moves like that and go, "Geez, what else is out there?" And the West Coast certainly looks very alluring.
I think you're absolutely right, Tim. It's just that they were ultimately those two and the Braves, for that matter, moving from Boston to Milwaukee in the same time period. They were just too timid. And I mean, if you look at it, Kansas City, which is the farthest west that any of those teams moved at that time, Kansas City is closer to Boston than it is to the West Coast. They just weren't willing to think too boldly about what was possible. And they were passing up what in 1950 was the third biggest market in the country in LA, and which by 1960 would be the second biggest market in the country.
So wouldn't have I guess from an American League perspective, well, no, actually both of the leagues, maybe you can sort of enlighten me. We've done a bunch of conversations around the Pacific Coast League, which, to those who were there around that time, I mean, they would fight you to say that it was about as major league as you were going to find. Certainly not day to day per se, but there were absolutely moments of equalness, if not maybe outperforming. Why wouldn't either of these leagues, either together in tandem to carve up the West Coast or separately as a move for their individual leagues, go after the PCL and sort of, I don't know, make a purchase, so to speak. It almost seems like it'd be ready made. Well, the rivalries or the names versus trying to expand their way and start anew, if you will, and try to start from scratch.
Well, I mean, the PCL made an effort to get themselves converted into a major league, and that ran from right after World War II until they finally gave up the ghost in about 1953. And the major leagues both leagues were simply resistant. I mean, I think ultimately they hoped to get those markets for themselves, but couldn't really just agree on how to go about it. And again, this is a function of the way that it's a very fragmented leadership structure. You have a commissioner whose duties are really very limited. I mean, we all expect the commissioner to be, the leader of baseball. He doesn't have any leadership role. I mean, if you read his job description, it's all about, protecting the image of the game and making sure gambling doesn't take place. I mean, that's why they put Landis in there to begin with, and what was still the job by this time, Ford Frick has it. But they're not willing to put anybody in charge. It's very fragmented among these owners. Very few of them are really paying attention and seeing the possibilities. And of course, they do want to reserve the markets for themselves. I mean, right before World War II, and I mean literally right before World War II, they nearly put a team into L.A. Phil Ball of the St. Louis Browns, who was probably in the worst shape of anybody in the majors, spent a year researching plane schedules and train schedules, and he worked out a schedule for the 1942 season, which the American League owners were prepared to accept. And he went to Chicago for the winter meetings, expecting to get that improved. He goes to a Chicago Cardinals football game on the afternoon of Sunday, December 7th, and here's the news. Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And he knew right away that, with a major war starting, there was no way they're going to allow him to move. By the end of the war, he sold the team. Nobody else is willing to grab that possibility and really go with it. I know in Los Angeles, reading the papers, many times in the mid to early 50s, when you're talking about that period where the Braves and Browns and Athletics all moved, and other weak teams like the Senators and the Reds are seen to be on the block, there's much talk in Los Angeles about getting a team and who it might be and all of that. But it never goes beyond the talking stage. These guys are, I mean, it was a risk. I mean, it's easy to look back today, certainly, and even a few years after the Dodgers and Giants moved, and think, whoa, these guys had it made from the beginning. Well, they weren't at all sure of that. I mean, there were risks involved, travel risks. I know the Dodgers had to guarantee every other team in the National League that team would take away literally as much visiting teams' share from their series in Los Angeles as they had the year before in Brooklyn, because those teams were all scared that O'Malley wasn't going to draw any attendance, wasn't going to make any money. And in retrospect, that just seems crazy, given the kind of attendance the Dodgers have had for 60 years now. But at the time, it was a real fear. It was not an established market. They were not really playing in any kind of a major league stadium. Nobody knew what this town was like. And of course, the Easterners all thought that Western people were, these kind of superficial bohunks. So I think it took some business courage to make the move that O'Malley and Stoneham made. It's really interesting too, because baseball is has historically and uniquely been sort of this I would say controlled chaos. It's interesting we're having this conversation in the spring of 2022, just after the latest collective bargaining agreement, and what's striking to me is just the sheer doubling down on
how can I best to genericizing baseball into one gigantic pot known as Major League Baseball. Whereas at this period of time, for our young whippersnappers listening, the American League and the National League were, yes, under the aegis of then organized baseball and what will become essentially formerly known as Major League Baseball, but they were dynamically different organizations. Yes, common rules, common whatevers, but unique rules to each league and sort of different sensibilities. And you're even mentioning it, 2 layers of management that oversaw those leagues that were, I guess, nominally orchestrated or at least overseen by a commissioner, quote unquote. Right. But it's interesting that dynamic, right? These 2 leagues were not as sort of conjoined and homogenized as they are today. These were very sort of different and oddly competitive, yet needing to be somewhat, I don't want to say cooperative, but at least understanding of the other, because they kind of needed each other, especially come to World Series time and other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. They were almost childishly competitive. I mean, the league presidents would go into the locker rooms at the All-Star games and make these rah-rah speeches about how we're going to win. They would they couldn't prevent. They would jawbone to stop the trading of any stars from one league to the other. If you go back until maybe the Frank Robinson trade, if you go back and look in the era before that, there are hardly any, even above average players who are traded from one league to the other. It just doesn't happen. Maybe a guy at the end of his career will change leagues, but the actual trade of one major leaguer to the other league just doesn't happen very often. And it would stay that way. Frankly, what changed it was Marvin Miller. All of a sudden, these guys realized that their real problem was the Major League Baseball Players Association, and they better just stop this childish, often dueling between the National League and the American League and deal with their real problem. And I think that's ultimately what led to the creation of Major League Baseball. They had to deal with the union.
All right, what's this? LinkedIn Jobs. Hey, these days it can be hard to find and hire the right candidates for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs made it easier to find the people that you want to talk to faster and for free. Create a free job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 770 million people. My goodness. Focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience and use screening questions to get your role in front of only the most qualified. Then use the simple tools on LinkedIn Jobs to quickly filter and prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. Yes, it's no surprise, friends, that LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Of course. Well, did you know that every week that nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Come on. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/goodseats. That's linkedin.com/goodseats to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And now back to our conversation. It's also very interesting, too. You look at sort of the expansion history of these 2 leagues, right? And you go to Wikipedia and just look up the pages of the expansions, and you'll see like the National League is like a handful, like maybe 10 sort of franchise grantings and or moves, and the relative stability. When then you flip over to the American League's page, and you see there's mistake after renaming after. Leaving and then a new franchise literally. Washington, right? Washington and Kansas City. I mean, these are 2 great examples here. Maybe we could use this as a segue, but it's shocking to me how in 2 separate cases, the case of the Washington Senators and the Kansas City Athletics, when those teams move, literally almost overnight, there's another franchise to take their place.
Mm-hmm.
One has to scratch their head and go, well, wait a minute. I mean, these teams left for a reason, and obviously probably complicated, but how do you expect a fan base to kind of just forget about what was for years ago and all of a sudden either embrace, even with the same name on top of that in some cases, a brand new whole cloth franchise that has zero of that and is essentially starting from scratch? I mean, to me, that's like cases 1 and 2 of how the American League, I don't know, couldn't get it right, so to speak.
They were driven, I think, by, considerations that either they created themselves, as they did in Kansas City by allowing Finley to move, or that, they should have bit the bullet about it. I mean, in 61, when they created the second version of the Senators, their fear was that Congress would rebel against them because the Senators couldn't go to baseball games anymore. And I think that was mistaken, something that it would take them a dozen years to realize when they let the second Senators go to Texas without any real repercussions from Congress at all. But they weren't willing to really do it. I mean, there was an interesting solution proposed at the time, because people could see that the Senators were the old Senators, the first Senators, were about to be good, as they would be when they became the Twins in the early to mid 60s. So it was proposed that those players Calvin Griffith desperately wanted to get out of Washington. So it was proposed that they give Calvin the expansion franchise in Minnesota, and he could go ahead and build up his team there. And the other people would get to keep the players that the fans in Washington had gotten to know and were clearly already major leaguers at that point, and allow them to stay. But that was nixed. Calvin wanted to keep his players. There's throughout this process in both leagues, there is enormous deference from one owner to another. Okay. Because ultimately, I think if I prevent my colleague here from doing something, I'm ultimately creating a precedent which will stop me from doing the same thing in the future. So they don't like to restrict an owner's big decisions about where he wants to play or how he wants to get his stadium financed or anything like that. There's just enormous deference there because they don't want to set up precedents that might come backfire on them.
Talk about what you hinted at it before, and we've had a couple of conversations on this, but I think it's lost on a lot of folks. In the early 60s, the rumblings and the shovel digging, I think, in some cases, around this Continental League. It seems to me that sort of hastened things too. But then even then, it looks like the National League, in some respects, outsmarted the American League once came and went, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very interesting episode, the whole Continental League thing. For a brief background, when after the Dodgers and Giants left, New York wanted to get a National League team back. They put a guy named Bill Shea in charge of a committee to do this. Shea was a New York lawyer. Shea went and hooked up with Branch Rickey, and Rickey had an idea for a third major league. And he started, and Rickey recognized from the beginning that to be successful, he was going to need ownership groups with deep pockets, because there'd be stadiums and scouting staffs and, minor league systems and all of that to be put together. And so he put the league together. There were two powerhouses who eventually became the ownership group of the Mets and the Astros. There was a fairly good group in Minneapolis built around Ham's Brewing and what became Target stores and groups like that. Jack Kent Cook in Toronto put together a fairly strong group. There was a group in Denver. There was theoretically groups in Atlanta and Los Angeles, but they really never got off the ground. But when it became clear to the major league owners that this group maybe did really represent a threat when they got into Congress. And Congress was debating a bill which would restrict how many minor leaguers each major league team could keep. And the majors won that vote, but they did it with a much smaller margin than their professional lobbyists had told them was going to be. And then they decided the Continental League was a factor, and they had a sit-down meeting in 1959 with them, and out of it comes this agreement, an agreement that is announced, okay, in which each league will expand by 2 teams, and the ownership group for those 4 teams will be chosen from the Continental League owners. Now, at the time, really nobody notices it, but one significant factor is that Del Webb, the owner of the Yankees and the power in their expansion committee, and Joe Cronin, the league president, say nothing about this. The agreement is announced by Walter O'Malley, backed up by Frick. All of the positive voices are coming from the National League. And that's because Del Webb knows that the Continental League doesn't have the ownership groups that he needs. From the American League's point of view, they have 2 goals, okay? They want into Southern California. They want a team in LA. That's the market they're desperate for. And the LA Continental League group never really came together. They never paid their dues to the league. They never really defined who they were. And the other market that the American League needs is one in Washington, because they have promised Calvin Griffin at this point that he can move his team to Minneapolis. And there is no Continental League group in Washington. So Webb doesn't, what shall I say? He doesn't knock down the idea that this is a done deal. He just says nothing. And so the dance with the Continental League starts. The National League, led by O'Malley, gets the 2 markets that they want. They want to get into Houston. They want to get back into New York, and they get the 2 strongest ownership groups. It's just a clear victory for the National League at that point.
But do you think that's bumbling or miscalculations or just or just luck, bad luck? I mean, where's Branch Rickey in all this, right? He's basically the guy behind the Continental League, the public face of it for sure.
But he's got no power. I mean, the Continental League is falling apart. I mean, it was an idea. That's what Branch had. He had an idea. Okay. But he doesn't control these owners. The owners want into Major League Baseball. Bill Shea gets one of them into New York. Those are the driving forces here. And Rickey can protest, as he does. He can call Webb names, as only Branch Rickey can. The definition of perfidy. But he really doesn't have any leverage to do anything else at this point. So the National League gets what it's want. The American League, I think, because they hadn't really thought the problem through. What markets do we want and how can we get into them? They knew they wanted into LA, but they hadn't lined up a group there. They hadn't gone to anybody who might be interested and had the money and say, hey, can you put together a group? They hadn't just gone to the Chamber of Commerce and say, hey, we're coming in. Why don't you guys, work out 4 or 5 groups who can apply to us? And they try and do it in a raging hurry because they want to be a year ahead of the American League. So it wasn't well thought out at all. They didn't step back. They didn't really try and figure out what their interests were. They got somewhat trapped because they felt they had to put a team into Washington, which was not the greatest market. I mean, there were others around the country. You could have gone into Dallas. You could have gone into Atlanta. You could have gone into Montreal or Toronto. I mean, all of those would eventually get franchises, and they were all available in 1961.
Well, and plus, you were also dealing with you're taking an old team, moving them, and putting a new team with the same name and slapping a new coat of paint on something that's brand new, right? It seems already you're going to put yourself in a ditch before you even get the new team.
Yeah. I mean, that was just, again, a lot of this is what I would call business courage. They weren't willing to, break off their ties with Washington. They just thought they were more important. They kind of failed to realize there was a new horizon out there.
It sounds like the American League was quite reactionary. You have a great quote in your preface or the intro from Bill Veeck. He said, planning is wholly out of keeping with the American League tradition of confronting all emergencies head on with capital panic and patchwork.
Yes.
Bill Veeck, and this is a guy obviously been there for decades, and he capitalized panic and patchwork. It does feel like not only that, you look at sort of the history of it, it looks like that. And it also feels to me, too, that there is that sort of, I guess, longstanding inferiority complex, too, because it's the quote unquote junior circuit, right? Which is kind of, funny to listen to. But there's that third chip on the shoulder that the National League seemed to kind of exude.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's part of that kind of school ground mentality that I was describing with Webb, in which they're trying to one up the National League, because it's so clearly in terms of attendance, in terms of integration, a lot of the innovations that had come about in the last 30 years or so are all coming out of the National League. Radio broadcasting, farm systems, those kind of things, those ideas are all growing out of the National League. Not out of the American League. And this is somewhat disguised by the dominance of the Yankees, that makes it look like the leagues are equal. And of course, in terms of winning World Series, the American League is more than equal. But in other areas, they are not doing as well. And they are not as progressive in their thinking about, where in a business sense, where is my market? Where am I going to make the most money? Where can I create the most stable franchises?
Well, you hinted at it before. Maybe a comparison of the ownership groups, right? I mean, we have not spoken of the name of by far the most illustrious and historic and Titanic Titans. Sorry, not Titanic. Titans. I'm sure there were some years. The New York Yankees, right, were clearly the beneficiaries, at least in the short term, when the two National League teams left for the West Coast. Where was their sort of role in all this? Because I having grown up in New York and seeing how dominant the Yankees have been on the landscape for decades, and still in many respects still are, it's kind of hard not to think that there's an assumption that keeping the American League a little bit, out of some of these sort of hyper competitive environments, and maybe to the betterment of, say, a franchise like the Yankees was maybe in their best interest, or maybe I'm just really reading into things.
Yeah, one of the most interesting facts is that in 1958, the Dodgers and the Giants leave New York, and the Yankees' attendance goes down. The city wasn't as excited about baseball as it had been. And I don't know exactly how the Yankees owners interpreted that. They were still, obviously they won the pennant in 1958, and they went to the World Series and won that as well.
Yeah, but you can't absorb those two longtime franchises and those fan bases, especially when the Yankees were essentially hated as local rivals, right? But then, longer term, right, in theory, it's the whole, New York metropolitan area market now, just with one franchise. That's, if you're a businessman, that's a pretty good opportunity in the years ahead.
Well, yeah, except I think there's two factors there that also played almost equally for Walter O'Malley in Los Angeles. One, for the benefit of my league, whether it's O'Malley or Webb who's talking, I need to get into that other guy's market because my league will be stronger if we do that. And second of all, that it's good to have a little rivalry in town. Yeah, there's an awful lot of people in New York who are, put it politely, National League fans or impolitely Yankee haters. And their interest in baseball would be stimulated by having a National League team. I mean, when the Mets show up, they are just awful, and yet people respond to them. So I think that...
And playing in the Polo Grounds, no less, which is falling apart.
Exactly. So I think there's a realization. I mean, I know Walter O'Malley doesn't really want another team in L.A., but he knows his league has to get into New York. And the exact opposite, I'm sure, is true of Webb. He knows his league needs to get into L.A., and he knows the price is going to be letting a National League team into New York. And he fights it. But Frick makes it pretty clear that the kind of legalistic arguments that Webb and Topping come up with are not going to stand. And so, Webb goes out to make the best deal he possibly can. So I think that I mean, they had an interest and they both recognized that interest, but in the real world, I think both of them knew it was not going to fly. They'd have to make a deal to let the other guy in.
This is all relatively quaint, especially when you look at it with the prism of today's, as I said earlier, homogenized Major League Baseball, right? I'm not a nostalgist per se, but it does, I think this book is really important as framework because there were for many, many years differences, unique, quirky differences. Now you're describing, I think, something that really hasn't been investigated for some time, and that's sort of the somewhat relatively ham-handedness of the approach of expanding the game in modern times. Yeah. But, the rules differences, right? The DH, right? The American League came up with that for as a way to speed up the game and make it a little bit more offensively exciting. And lo and behold, that one's coming over, and now it's going to be the law of the land across both leagues now. So they didn't get it completely wrong, I guess, but it's very interesting to see how sort of this, intra-league or inter-league or internal squabble and or competitiveness almost sadly doesn't somewhat seem to matter anymore. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I mean, it does tend to homogenize things. I mean, neither the American League nor the National League exists really in any real life terms anymore. They are simply labels to create an all-star game and a World Series. And I think a lot of that has disappeared. But again, I think that goes back to the Players Association and its growth and it especially its growth in power over the years. I mean, it's they've been talking about how they lost the previous two CBA negotiations, but the fact of the matter is they were in such a strong position already that they were giving something back, but they weren't giving all that much back, and certainly not at the top end of the pay scale. So I think that it's changed. It's probably driven more by the changing economics of the game than by anything else, and the fact that they are now kind of they got used to talking to each other because they were concerned with Marvin Miller. And then when they started talking with each other, they realized how much, I think, all of the non-union related issues were the same between each league. When Peter Ueberroth comes in and says, why do we have 20 separate contracts for unions? Or sorry, for travel, for airport travel. Why do we have 20 separate contracts for uniforms and this and that? And begins to show them that by doing these kind of industry-wide negotiations, he can cut their costs. It's little things like that basically begin to put the people from the leagues at the same table consistently and recognizing how their interests cross, how the really important differences are not between National League and American League, but between small market and large market. And I think that contributed to the, what shall I say, the dominance of the leagues and the different leagues. I mean, I miss that. I mean, I grew up as a National League fan, I kind of miss some of those rivalries, but the game moves on, sometimes in the right direction, sometimes not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I mean, I had the luxury of growing up in the New York metro area and had two teams to kind of choose from and root for and see the differences of close up, right? And in that case, the Mets were always sort of the scruffy number two to the dominant and historically rich Yankees, and I'm sure it was different here in Chicago too, which was the reverse, right? Where sort of the White Sox were a bit. Always sort of like the second fiddle, and we're constantly talking about moving and stuff. It's interesting. I think this part of baseball's history is not only fascinating but important because around these years, right, there was a distinct difference between these leagues, and for different reasons. And I think you're highlighting some of them, right? The ownership groups for each of these leagues were a bit sort of differently minded. And in many respects, it showed when they pulled the trigger on major and significant moves, right? But, I think for every mismanaged expansion decision that the American League made or a reactive one, in some respects, you look at things like the DH rule, that survived. And that was a sort of a way to sort of approach keeping the game fresh and interesting to fans and somewhat more competitive versus sort of the dead wood, if you will, of a pitcher who, hadn't swung a bat in 15 years, right?
Tim, don't get me going on the DH rule.
Not a fan, huh?
Not a fan, no. I think it takes away. It does
take strategy out of things, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, I think the difference now, last time I looked at it, is the difference in total runs per game between a National League game and an American League is 0.43 runs. That's not a lot. And you're giving up a lot of strategy. I remember a story I wrote, 30 years ago, probably, about signs and signals. And I was interviewing some third base coaches, and I asked an American League third base coach about it. And his response is, we don't give any signals before about the sixth inning. We just, we stand around and wait for the big guy to hit a home run. So they were taking that whole strategic level out of the American League game. And watching a pitcher flail at three strikes is not the most entertaining thing. But at the same time, they can do something, some of it surprisingly. Some of them who really make an effort. Like I get to watch Kershaw here in LA, and he's not much of a hitter, but boy, does he try. He's become an excellent bunter. He chops at the ball. There are things going on in his head, and as a fan, you can watch them and see them. And that to me is what's interesting. I'm one of these, I guess, the two people in the entire world who like that ghost runner on second in extra innings. Not because it shortens the game, because I think it causes all the managers and the players in the field to think a lot more than they had to. And I like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I the pitching clock and I speeding it up just for its own sake. But, the idea of strategizing, when you take the strategy out or you homogenize it, I don't, to me, the rivalries, I think, are the things that's the thing that I think to me is going to get hollowed out. And, for every, Yankees Red Sox rivalry, and the crosstown classics now are in Chicago and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, those are terrific. But, I guess for everybody who laments the fact that intra-league and intra-division rivalries are going to be far less or certainly less played. There's that story out of Pittsburgh, right? Hey, the Yankees haven't been here in 20 years. We get to see them now for a series or two, right? And I don't know, maybe it is a bit of spreading the wealth, but I think we lose some stuff, a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of the history, which this game has more than any other sport in this country, right? And I don't know, you tinker with that, and then it just becomes just another billionaire's play toy.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with those Pittsburgh Yankees series, at least the ones in Pittsburgh. Because, I mean, basically, it looks to me like with the interleague games we get right now, if you've got a natural rivalry, Yankees, Mets, Dodgers, Angels, A's, Giants, White Sox, Cubs, Royals, Cardinals, Reds, Indians, Guardians. You do see a noticeable increase in attendance. I mean, people are clearly buying into that. But then you get the non-rivalry games in the opposite league, and they do no better, if that, than they do against playing their own natural league opponents. So, I mean, I think it's worked to that extent. But if you're a team that doesn't have a natural rival, I don't know that it helps you much at all. And like you say, it does diminish the importance of leagues. I mean, everything. I mean, the whole playoff structure is designed to diminish the importance of leagues because it diminishes the importance of winning the league.
Yeah, and I think the heritage is too, right? And this is the historian or the amateur armchair historian in me, right? It's like, the people barely recognize like where these names came from, or why they exist, or how they got that way, or from what city this franchise originally emanated from. I mean, all that stuff it's hard enough to sort of prevent that from being whitewashed. And now I think this is just one gigantic new coat of paint that's only going to make it worse to remember any of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the biggest trouble is you're not seeing kids pick up the game that we did, both playing and reading about it and, learning about it when, we're kids. You're reading My Greatest Day in Baseball and, all those kind of books that we read when we were kids. And I see that I remember my son coming home lamenting one summer day, and he said it was boring today. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I tried to get a baseball game, but nobody else wanted to play, because all of his kids, basketball, video games, stuff like that. They're not coming to the game. They're not being brought to the game. And so they're not learning that stuff that, slowly seeped into our consciousness about franchise moves and old names and great games and all of that kind of stuff. It's getting lost. I mean, there'll always be crazy people like us who learn it, but the broader fan base is disappearing.
All right. Well, I'm not gonna leave it on that note. So let me just leave you with I'm going to put you on the spot here. So of all the research that you did in the American League and its bumblingness, if shall we say, in its expansion thing. So which let's call them lineages of which lineage to you was the most interesting and or head scratching, or did you learn something curious about that maybe you didn't know going in? And I'll give you a few choices, right? So there's the Philadelphia to Kansas City to Oakland A's tree. There's the Washington Senators to Minnesota, and then the new Senators to Texas thing. So the Senators-ish. And maybe the travails of the Angels, right, who seem to want to be in Los Angeles, but they want to be really broadly California, and then they're Orange County, and then they're Anaheim, now the Anaheim Angels. To me, those are kind of like, and Seattle doesn't count, right? Okay, the Seattle Pilots doesn't count because that's just the ultimate.
You're taking the big one away from me.
I did take it away. Are any of those more curious than others in your mind, or do any sort of things sort of stand out from any of those? Because they're all just crazy in their own sort of way.
Yeah, I guess the strangest thing to me is why the American League, first of all, allowed Charlie Finley in, and then why they continued to not only tolerate him, but to let him get away with stuff. I mean,
and why not the orange baseball? We need that back.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But he tries to move to Dallas. They shoot him down. He tries to move to Louisville. They shoot him down. But then they let him go to Oakland. Why? And I think it's because they wanted, a bigger market on the West Coast. But the point, why did they let this guy in to begin with? They got warning. I mean, they asked some of their members to go out and, check around Wall Street and stuff and find out about this guy. And the recommendation that came back is don't touch him. But they went ahead and touched him. Not only touched him, they let him into the room. And I really think that, having people like that who were not at all interested in the overall good performance of their league really makes it much harder for them to operate. He's always going to be in there agitating and not agitating particularly well. I mean, sometimes clearly he was right. He was the only one in the room who seemed to understand Marvin Miller. But ultimately he is, he doesn't play well with others.
Yes, and our story about the California Golden Seals of the National Hockey League is certainly evidence of that too. He's a conundrum across leagues, and he's an equal opportunity concerning soul for sure. Yes,
exactly. I mean, he's not going to get along.
All right. Well, this has been great. I lament the fact that the leagues and the distinctions between them are ever blurring. But I think it's important, right? This kind of stuff is hugely important because it is the fabric of the game. It is where the teams came from and their identities, and it's all wrapped up. It's in, history is often very messy, often very convoluted. But to ignore it is probably the worst sin you could ever have. And partially it's kind of why we do these shows, because, these are little nooks and crannies that people most often forget. And I think it's timely that this comes out, and I'll let you promote in a second. It comes out now, literally in the midst of what is going to be, I think, a next generation of hugely significant evolutionary changes in this game. Call it modernization or call it an abandonment of what got them there. I don't know. It's probably something in between, but I don't know. I'm erring towards the sides of cynicism. I hate to say. Yeah, well,
I think they need to do some things. And of course, I have my ideas about what I'd like to see them do, but something's got to give. I mean, to me, their ultimate problem is television. Football, basketball are tremendous games for television. You can get everything on one screen and people can see it. Baseball, it's too physically diverse. You get a runner on base and a ball in the gap. You can't, if I'm sitting in the stands, I can kind of keep everything on one corner of my eye. But if I'm watching on TV, there goes the ball in the gap. Where's the runner? And then you've got these announcers who tell you about what one runner does, but not what the other runner does. So I think it's a problem for them, and that is a problem that is not going to go away. People raised on television, don't think get a real appreciation of the game.
All right, time to promote. Name the book, when's it coming out, and what are you going to do to promote it? Hopefully you're going to get out there a little bit now that things are seemingly relaxing a little bit, and maybe some book signings or what?
Yeah, I hope so. The book is called Stumbling Around the Bases. The American League Mismanages the Expansion Eras. I am told it has arrived at the publisher's warehouse a month late. And is going to be distributed. It's already available on like Amazon. And I think copies will be going out to bookstores. Certainly you can get it directly from Nebraska if you want to. And yeah, I'll be doing some other, opportunities like this one with you. And I will be getting out to some signings, especially at SABR meetings. Yeah, I think there are just some great stories to be told from this book. I'd love to tell them.
All right. Our many, many thanks to Andy McHugh. The book is either coming out in a couple of days and you can pre-order it, or it's already out and available for purchase. It just depends on whether you're listening to this before or on or after April 1st. That's the dividing line. But regardless, it's called Stumbling Around the Bases, the American League's Mismanagement in the Expansion Eras. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. And it is a great read. You will learn a lot, as I did. And it's compelling stuff if you've ever fancied yourself as a historian of baseball and, frankly, just to me, the fascinating, torturous journeys of teams going from city to city or expanding in that and whatnot. And a great example of how to not necessarily do it in the American League's case. You can find a convenient link to that book, by the way. We're available wherever books are found, of course. But if you'd like to give us a few shekels of referral love, we always appreciate that. Keep our lights going. You can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 254, my goodness, with Andy McCue, and you'll find a convenient link to the book, and you will do so. By the way, while you're there, why don't you also check out Andy's book from 2015, also published by the University of Nebraska Press, he says, called Mover and Shaker, Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers, and Baseball's Westward Expansion. It's arguably the companion book to this American League festival that we just talked with Andy about for the last hour or so. No more important person in the shakeup of the National League and the terrain of Major League Baseball than he in that process, moving the Dodgers and then behind them the Giants. That wasn't sort of done just by chance. There was sort of some rhyme and reason behind it, and that's a great book too. And you can order that through our little convenient link too. However you get it, by all means get it and both of them. Frankly, you'll be glad you did. It'll be wonderful pre-summer beach reading material, ready and raring to go when the days get hotter and the beach beckons. Let's see what else. While you're on goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can see well, they're there for you to see. You can search them up as well. But of course, you can listen to every single stinking episode we've ever done. We put them all on the website. You can stream them. You can share them with friends. You can do whatever you want. Of course, the most logical way to ensure that you get every single episode of this show is to subscribe to us or follow us, for God's sakes, and wherever you get or consume or stream or listen to podcasts. We're available just about everywhere you can find them, for God's sake. So just do that at least. And of course, if there's a place where you can rate and review them, well, we appreciate it, especially if it's a damn good one. Please do so there. We love that. Apple for sure. Spotify, I think's getting into that. Doesn't matter. Wherever you can rate and review, please do it. We appreciate that. And it's going to help other people find the show. Let's see. goodseatsstillavailable.com. Also the place where you can sign up for our weekly email newsletter. Just search around. You'll find a link for that. Our social media feeds, of course. Social media is where we, try to promote and interact with some of our fans. Twitter at goodseatsstill. Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, there's a page called Good Seats Still Available. And yes, you can send us email as well. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Last but not least, they're not booing, they're yelling Jerry Payne. And he is, of course, our chief cook and bottle washer when it comes to putting all of our pieces together and editing. We've given him some really interesting challenges this week, but we appreciate his work, not only this week, but every single week. And we appreciate you, of course, for listening. Thanks so much for doing so. We'll see you next week. Enjoy whatever sports that are out there. There's lots seemingly out there. Hope you're enjoying the spring thus far, and hopefully it's warming up where you are. Until next week, take care and love you. Bye.